So I've logged 63 authoritarian actions this week. Some of the big ones are Hegseth allegedly ordering survivors of a boat strike to be killed off the coast of Venezuela, which is a move that ex-senior military lawyers have called a war crime, and a really massive escalation in anti-immigrant rhetoric following the tragic shooting of 2 National Guard members in DC. But there are other stories, and here are 3 that probably didn't make it to you, even though they probably should have. So let's start with some attacks on organisations promoting diversity, equity and inclusion, also known as DEI. So before I actually say what's happened this week, I just want to remind people that DEI practices are things like institutions having diversity goals for hiring or promotion, or running outreach and mentoring programs with underrepresented communities. So what's happened? So the first thing that happened is that the US military, which has partnered with the Scouts of America for 100 years, has now severed ties with the Scouts this week. And Hegseth basically said it was because of the DEI policies of the Scouts, which he said meant it was no longer a meritocracy or boy-friendly. And what that means is that the Pentagon is no longer going to help with the Scouts' annual National Jamboree. And it also means that it will no longer host Scouts visiting on educational trips and things like that. And then the second thing that happened is that the US State Department is proposing to exclude 38 universities, including Harvard and Yale, from its diplomacy lab partnership. And again, they said that's because they don't like their DEI practices. And what the diplomacy lab program does is it pairs university researchers with State Department policy officers. And the idea is that you want kind of the latest research to factor in to state diplomacy. So the thing about shaking up kind of the diplomacy lab is that I don't actually think Hegseth cares about DEI and diplomacy as such. I think it's just a way to punish universities the administration doesn't like. But actually, it kind of matters, right? Because many of the countries that you want to do diplomacy with are the ones that are most culturally different from the US. So actually, this is somewhere where you really want to get minoritized voices into the room. So the kind of longer term consequences of these continued attacks on any kind of organisation that has DEI policies are twofold. So firstly, it just makes life harder for anyone who's not a straight white man. But secondly, it really suppresses dissent, and it's a way of bringing any organisation that might oppose the government to heel, really. So for instance, on Saturday, news broke that Northwestern University had reached a deal with the Trump administration to restore $800 million that had been withdrawn earlier this year. And the deal includes paying the administration $75 million, but also promising to cut all the DEI programs. And you can just kind of see how these kind of capitulations, if you like, are acquiescing to the administration's kind of worldview, that what they really want is to go back to the kind of cultural society of the 1960s. So the second thing I really wanted to cover is ongoing threats to public health. So one thing is the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, is seeking to abandon some really tough standards for soot pollution. When the EPA previously brought in those standards, they said that reducing soot pollution could prevent thousands of premature deaths a year in the US. And the reason this matters is that soot is really bad for you, particularly really fine soot particles. Because they're so small, they can get into the bodies and get past the body's defenses. So they can get into your lungs, your heart, your blood, even your brain. And the smaller the particle, the worse it is, because it kind of becomes biologically more active in your body. And decades of research have shown that basically chronic exposure to these small soot particles shortens life, accelerates disease processes, and harms almost every major organ system. And so reducing these standards and allowing more of these particulates to be produced, by vehicles or by industry, really does affect every American, particularly those living in areas with higher air pollution. So the administration has kind of been undermining vaccines pretty much since the spring when RFK Jr. took office. But this week has seen even more escalation on that front. Firstly, the director of the Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA, the head of its vaccine division, told agency staff in a memo that an internal review had found that at least 10 children had died because of COVID vaccines, which sounds really scary. But basically what happened is that there is this kind of unverified reporting system. It's called VAERS in America. We have something similar actually in the UK. And basically what it is that it encourages doctors or patients or family members to upload anything that they think might be associated with a vaccine. It doesn't mean it is. So it's just encouraging people to upload it. It's not verified, and you should never use that system for drawing conclusions about whether a vaccine causes harm or not. But effectively what happened was that the administration, with its new kind of vaccine skeptic hat on, has gone, well, what one researcher called dumpster diving into that database to try and find scary numbers. And this is what they found. And then what they've done because of that is they've now used that as an excuse to further tighten vaccine regulations in the US. So they've made it harder to get approvals. They've promised to relook at annual booster policies and so on. And experts have said this is actually really dangerous because it will just make it much harder to approve new vaccines and even annual boosters. And then kind of in parallel to all of that going on, the CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control, have appointed a new deputy director, who is another known vaccine skeptic. He used to be a senior health official in Louisiana during the pandemic. And when he was there, he refused to promote COVID vaccines and also said that COVID vaccines were dangerous. And I just want to kind of remind people that a Commonwealth Fund study from 2022 estimated that COVID vaccines prevented more than 18 million US hospitalizations and 3 million deaths and saved the country over $1 trillion. It's just so pernicious how they're just chipping away at the things that keep Americans healthy. So the last thing that I just wanted to touch on, which I'm pretty sure is under the radar, is kind of exporting nationalism. So what do I mean by exporting nationalism? Well, I mean just that, right? So the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has ordered American diplomats in various US allies across Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to basically encourage their host governments to restrict almost all immigration. And if those governments aren't doing that, he wants the diplomats to file reports back to him. And it's all part of this kind of agenda that President Trump and his top aides have of talking about migrants and immigrants as a bad thing. You know, they call it a scourge, they call it an attack, an invasion, and so on. And they've publicly said that about Europe. They've said it about individual European countries, including the UK and Germany and France. And really, they have been adopting the language of far-right political parties across the world, both now and in history, to do so. And so it's just another example of how the US is trying to use its really outsized influence on the world to promote its own kind of version of populist nationalism more generally. So the reason that I picked those three topics is really because they fall directly into the standard authoritarian playbook, right? The first is you attack your marginalized populations. And that's where you start. Pretty much every populist regime has done that in history. The second one is you also want to attack science and the elites, and you want to attack any other kind of sources of knowledge making. And then the third one is global destabilization, where you do want to undermine kind of stable democracies. And you can see, for instance, that Putin's been doing that for decades.